Hey, everybody, we got a few people coming in. I've got everybody on mute right now, but towards the end of this, I will open it back up. We've got Bob uh taking care of a little bit of business, about to be back on. See some names I recognize, see some names I don't recognize. So welcome everybody here. We had a good sign up for this thing, so I appreciate everyone coming on with me. The had almost 100 people sign up, but as usual, I think what a lot of people do, even when I'm doing some of you guys may know me from Backcountry Journeys. Even when I do the Backcountry Journeys, typically we have a lot of people sign up, but only a few ever show up. I can track, and a lot of people watch them in the recording later on. So uh when Bob gets back, we'll go ahead and get formally started. So, and of course, I am recording this, so as soon as we're as soon as it's over, I will post it to the web.
Just, kind of.
I'll I'll post this to the web, and you'll be able to watch it back later on. So while we're waiting on Bob, I think I heard him coming back. We'll go ahead and get started in a minute. There he is. Hang on. I muted you because I could hear the background stuff. So you there,
Okay.
Bob? Okay,
Yep.
good. Good. So we got our crowd filling in. We've got a few more people joining us. Again, welcome everybody. My name is Russell Graves. I'm coming to you live from Hackberry Farm, just north of Dodge City, Texas. And I'm excited to be here tonight. This is a little bit of a departure from what I've done before. I know like Stan has been on my webinars before, and Stan, usually I do them at noon every day, but this is, and I usually do them as part of Backcountry Journeys, but this is a little bit of a departure on how we're doing it, because most of the time it's always been kind of PowerPoint based and presentation based. But tonight I'm honored to have Bob Malish with me, and Bob is the smartest guy I know. So how's that for an introduction?
That's troubling.
Tell us about yourself.
Well, I've been in the photo industry. When I think about how I got started in all of this, I was a snotty-nosed 12-year-old kid in middle school, that somehow or another got on the yearbook staff, and that just sort of, I guess in a lot of ways, sort of changed my life. And seeing the first picture ever come up in the developer in the darkroom, you see that silver magic happen, and you get entranced by the smell of Fixer, and the next thing here we are talking about all these crazy digital things. And photography is just magic for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. And I've actually been doing what I've been doing at Canon for 39 years now, and to see the changes in the photo industry and how the business has grown, and how people have engaged photography, and even how photography has changed through COVID, has been one of those things that I think a lot of people, they had no idea that some of these things would happen in the photo industry, but they have. And it's really magic. All the ways that people engage photography, and how it's history of their lives that happens in front of them that they can capture, but it's everybody has a different use of photography in terms of what they want to do with it, whether it's art, whether it's documentation, whether it's journalism, whatever it may be. Photography has just really I think opened up the world to a lot of people for a lot of the right reasons.
I agree. I'll tell you a little bit about my Canon story and about my photography story in general. I fell in love with it early, and I fell in love with it because of Canon, but not in the reasons you think. My older brother, and by the way, where I'm sitting right now, I grew up a mile north of here. So I live on a farm. I bought a farm that's been in my family for a long, long time now. And but I grew up just north of here. And when my older brother, his name's William, but we call him Bubba, he joined the Army when I was like a freshman in high school, and he got stationed in Alaska. And when he got stationed there, our sister gave him a Vivitar camera, and he loved photography, so he bought a Canon A1 camera and started using that in a good set of lenses. So he sent me that old Vivitar, and that's why I got my start in photography. And I used that thing till it broke about a year and a half. And then my first camera equipment was my first good camera equipment I had was Minolta stuff that I shot and filmed. And so I had a lot of stuff published early on with that film camera. And then when everything started moving to digital, I knew I was ready to switch. And let me, this is a prop, and you can pass this on down the line, whoever needs to hear it or wants to hear it. But when I was getting ready to switch to digital, I sent Nikon an email and I sent Canon an email and saying, what kind of professional service and support do you have? And Nikon says, hey, the best pros in the world use our gear. Go to our website and check it out. Well, some nice lady from Canon says, hey, give me a call tomorrow. So I called her up and she said, look through our website, pick out 3 or 4 pieces of gear that you want to use. I'll loan it to you for a month. And I know that once you use it, you'll want to switch to Canon. And that's the number one reason why I sold all my other stuff. And I've been a Canon shooter for more than 20 years now, is because of that one interaction I had with Canon's customer service. So
So
that's
do you know who that lady was?
I don't remember. I know she was awfully nice because I was like, you know, barely in my 30s, and she was willing to send me all that stuff. And I've been happy with Canon. So I started shooting Canon when I was still shooting film. I was shot what was the 1V, I think they were
Right.
the 1V and the EOS 3. I had those and a lot of the same lenses I bought back then I still use today. That's how rugged the lenses are. So I've been a Canon fan for a long time. I know a lot of good cameras manufacturers make quality equipment, but I've always been partial to Canon. But you know, you were mentioning early when you first started talking about a lot of people see photography as in a lot of different ways, and I think to me that's what's fascinating about the medium. And when I'm teaching these workshops, one of the things that I try to remind people of all the time is I kind of feel like right now we're living in the good old days of photography, because never has there been a time when these cameras are capable of doing so much. I mean, they're capable of doing so much. I can't keep up with everything they can do. I forget some of the functions that I can use in the field, and I do it for a living and do it all the time. And so, kind of speak to that a little bit. I mean, where have you seen the industry come from in your time at Canon? I mean, do you agree with my assessment that we're living in the good old days?
Well, I think we're living in the best of times. I don't even know that it's the good old days. I mean, you think about all the foundational things about photography that we all know from the past, and how much of that foundational information that we learned potentially from a film camera, you know, how much of that stuff still applies to a digital camera. But now, you know, we're able to fine tune all of that stuff and work in environments that are not limited by, you know, the film medium itself. You know, one of the very first sort of convictions for me that I think a lot of people had, you know, when they were working with film back in the day, they knew there were certain places they could not go and make pictures. You know, and I've had 2 very particular instances in that regard. And one of them was when the editor of Texas Highways called me one day right after lunch, and he goes, you know, everybody knows Texas Highways is based in Austin, and they had just gone on to Taylor for lunch. And they went to this old, dark, dank barbecue restaurant in Taylor. And for those of you that know restaurants in Taylor, it's not Louis Miller's. It's actually the Taylor Cafe. And so the Taylor Cafe has 2 sides. It has a restaurant, and then it has kind of a bar and pool hall. And the bar and pool hall is lit by light over the pool table and a couple of neon beer signs on the wall. And when Mike Murphy called me and said, and he sent me that picture, and he goes, I've never been able to take a film picture in this place. And he took a PowerShot G9 in there and made a picture in that hall, the beer hall of the Taylor Cafe. And he said, I think it's time we start talking about digital, because it has some capabilities that I don't have with film, and I want it. And so I think that's what people are starting to understand, that there are capabilities that you have nowadays that you didn't always have with film. And, you know, early on, there were a lot of people that said, well, I'll switch to digital when it looks like film. Well, the reality of a 35 millimeter piece of film and the grain structure at 100 ISO, you have about 18 million bits of silver grains on that 35 millimeter piece of film. Well, you think about the file size from a digital camera, at 18 megapixels when we crossed a 6 megapixel camera, and you think about 6 megapixels times red, green, and blue, that's 18 million bits of information right there. And, where are we now with the megapixel rating of cameras? The standard cameras now are in the 20 megapixel range, which is a 60 megapixel file size, for a lot of folks. And then, they go all the way up. I was watching something on YouTube this morning that they were, there's a new 100 megapixel Hasselblad that's out there that, I mean, that's a huge file size. And, we used to always think, well, that your resolution on a film camera always came from your film size. Well, the same thing's happening with file size now in digital cameras. But the size of the sensor really does make a difference in terms of what you can do with that file, because the size of the sensor and the size of the pixel have everything to do with how much light that pixel can capture.
So that's why, I mean, just the fact is, that's why smartphones can't touch a good mirrorless or DSLR.
That's it exactly. And people still ask me, well, what's the best camera you have? And it's what my answer is still the same. It's the one you got, and that's the crazy thing, that so many people, they have these, and they live with these in their pocket all the time. And it's, that's why you see so many pictures when things that are happening in the world now, they start on a smartphone. But, if that's the camera you have, that's the one you use. But the reality of it is that the smartphone is not going to do the same thing, that an actual, camera device has the capability of doing, just if nothing else, because of the size of the sensor in the camera. The size of the sensor has everything to do with the size of the pixel. So.
And this is anecdotal when I say this. It's not backed up by any kind of facts or studies, just my hunch. But it seems to me that, well, again, anecdotally, that excuse me, I've got the iPhone Pro Max 14. When you take a picture, it looks really good on the screen, but when you put it on the big screen of a computer to kind of analyze it critically, it really has some problems when you get a little bit bigger. It's still usable. In fact, I see, I don't mean to call Earl out in the bunch here, but I know I've shot a few pictures that ended up being in Texas Parks and Wildlife with an iPhone. And so they're perfectly capable of doing that. But the image quality, size for size, out of this iPhone Pro Max 14, which was the standard up until a couple weeks ago, can't touch what I was even shooting with the 1D Mark III that I've still got. There's just a big difference in quality. And that 1D Mark III is a 10 or 12-year-old camera, I think.
Right.
Something like that.
Well, and so the same thing applies with a smartphone image versus a film camera. How many of you back in the day, if you're older than 50, you probably know what an Instamatic camera was, and it had 110 film in it. The same thing applies to a small sensor in a digital camera versus a big sensor in a digital camera. Is the size of that sensor has everything to do with what's going to happen, when you start enlarging the pixels. And, if you start with a really, really small pixel, and you start enlarging it, it's not going to look the same when you run it across a double truck spread of a slick printed magazine like Texas Parks and Wildlife. The image just doesn't hold up. And so, a lot of that foundational information that we have about photography and knowing about where image quality comes from, a lot of that stuff still applies in the electronic world, just in terms of what we can do, with those images and where they start. So it's pretty significant.
Okay, I want to get back to that a little bit. I just want to remind everybody that came in late. I've got everybody muted right now. I'll turn everybody on towards the end of the presentation if anybody has any questions for Bob as we go along. I may cover it in our conversation we're having now, but if not, be patient with me. I'll turn that on later on. And again, if you're coming in late, Bob Malish, Canon USA. Bob's been with Canon for 39 years now. And so he knows a lot about the medium, a lot about Canon cameras. And just I've known Bob, I don't know how long we've known each other, 20 years now. But Bob's just the best thing is he's just a nice guy. But on the subject of the smartphones and the computational photography that they use to be able to figure out, whether it's a motion blur that they can do or some of the low light photography they're capable of doing. What is there? Will mirrorless cameras and DSLRs always be kind of lean towards the more manual and focus on the craft and not be a do it all? I mean, does computational photography ever come into that kind of medium in the foreseeable future?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think when you start looking at cameras like some of the more advanced Canon mirrorless products now, I mean, their subject recognition capability and subject tracking capability, those things are very much in the mix now, just in terms of, your image capture capabilities. And, that technology has really come a long way in a very short period of time. You were talking about just a few minutes ago about, some of the last two film cameras that you had were the EOS 1V and the EOS 3. And it's ironic that you mentioned the EOS 3 because the EOS 3 was one of those cameras that had one of the very first versions of a pretty significant function, which was eye controlled focus. When you look through the viewfinder, your eye could tell the camera where to focus. And that technology has just recently come back in the EOS R3, which is ironic that they're both categories of that camera were, some designation of the 3. But, the R3 has that capability of eye control focus working on both sides of the camera. So your eye can tell the camera where to focus from the back side of the camera. But then once the camera sees what subject it needs to be focusing on, it has the capability of tracking that subject and then letting the focus point move around the viewfinder, just like this camera that I'm using right now. It has facial recognition in it, but at the same time, it can pick up on a subject in the foreground or the background very readily as well.
Which,
So,
which that's an amazing technology, the eye tracking.
well, and so that's what's turned on in this camera that I have right now. And this is it's one of the developments that, crazy enough, came out of COVID. So I'm using an EOS R6 as my webcam tonight. But that camera is so advanced in terms of its capabilities, and you look at how good the image quality is. I mean, you can see all of the hairs on my eyebrows and everything else. But you would expect that from a little higher level camera, but there's no reason that you have to use that camera just as, a nature and wildlife camera or a landscape camera or anything else. I mean, I can tell you that to put video on a television screen, takes a pretty high level camera, but this camera will do that. So,
And really, that's the amazing thing too, as we talk about the convergence of, or if I talk about the convergence of digital and video, all of a sudden that we're all videographers now, or all have the capability of doing videography, and especially now with the Canons, their ability to do 8K.
we're
I mean, that,
content creators.
yeah, that just all of a sudden makes every one of the machines even more and more versatile. One of the things I do when I teach workshops, and people always they're there to take still photographs, but more and more I push them, just record some vignettes, 10 seconds worth of video while you're here. You've shot, like Jan shot, I think 80 million. Is that the number of bear pictures you shot? Yeah. So
And
we
it's
were
growing.
in Alaska. And so, I tell them, shoot a little bit of video, put the thing on slow motion, because it's amazing that those things will shoot, 120 frames a second at 4K. And when you're talking about a salmon jumping out of a river into a bear's mouth, all of a sudden that little vignette that you can get really changes people's experience. And so that's what I appreciate about the technology and how it's growing, is just you've got all those tools right there in a little 1 pound package that you can do amazing things with. Whether you're a beginner or whether you're seasoned, whether you're really advanced, it's just pretty amazing that we're able to do everything we can do. Computational photography aside, I don't care much about that stuff. I can figure out how to do it with my camera, but just ability to shoot 8K video and shoot high megapixel images and shoot raw images and have the eye focus tracking. And that goes back to what I said about living in the good old days right now. I mean, this is the time it's really exciting to be a photographer.
Well, there's so much that you can do, with the technology that's in these cameras now. And, when I think back to, when fairly high level digital photography really started, really wasn't all that long ago. I mean, the first $15,000 digital cameras we sold were, started in about 1996. And those cameras basically allowed people, that were working in the news and information business to stay on site for, a news story longer. And they had the capability of transmitting that picture pretty much immediately. But you think about now, we can do that with one of these too. But the reality of what's even better is that now I can take my EOS R6 and I can transmit the picture to this, and then I can use this as the communication device that it was really designed to be in the first place.
Yeah.
And I can transmit a much better image because of that. So, how you adapt the technology to work for what you need it to do, is really ironic. And so, in the early days of digital, there was a guy that just recently, a lot of people may have heard his name, but they didn't really realize who he was. A really famous photographer that used to work in Washington, D.C. His name was Dirk Halstead. And he worked around the business. I mean, he worked at a lot of different agencies, and he was a famous war photographer back in the Vietnam days. And but when digital first got started, Dirk was one of the first guys that started promoting the aspect of, being able to shoot electronically and have a camera that would do stills and video both and do them both very well. And so he called it, he wanted that camera to be called a platypus camera. Now, you think about in nature what a platypus is, and a platypus is one of those very interesting, animals in nature that can live in the water and out of the water. And that's what he wanted a platypus camera to be. He wanted to be able to do stills and video at the same time and be able to very quickly cross over the platforms between the two, to have him have one tool that basically provided him content that, when you think about all the media that's being presented to us now, he wanted one tool to be able to do the same thing. He didn't want to have to rely on the guy standing next to him to be able to shoot video while he was only shooting stills.
Yeah.
He wanted to do it both. And, in some ways, I think he was kind of greedy that way because he wanted the money too. But at the same time, hey, if you're in business for yourself, what do you do? So, it's amazing how the technology has changed the way that we're able to work. And you go around now and you start watching, a lot of local television news, and they have people that are out there. Here in the Dallas Fort Worth area, there's a show on the NBC affiliate in the mornings called Texas Today. And, they have people that they're sending out as a one-man band application. They're the reporter, they're the photographer, they're the producer, and they do it all. And you think about that, it takes one camera now to do that, and you have that capability that, 25 years ago, we didn't really have. And so that's why I tell people now, you're not just a photographer, you're not just a videographer, you're a content creator. And if you do it right, you can present it across every platform that you want to present it to, because especially with the right camera, the image quality is there to be able to do anything you want.
Yeah. Hey, what are some common features you hear people requesting on cameras?
Just better autofocus, better, functionality in terms of just how they're able to use cameras. They're looking for simplicity, but at the same time, they're still looking for high functionality. And there's certain things that I can I can give an example of, like, a lot of the new Canon products have what we call an FV mode. That would be Frank Victor. And there's I look at the tops of some of these cameras and I recognize what they're capable of doing. And of course, now this camera is not going to focus for me like it should. But the FV mode is basically gives you the capability of, you can fine tune, the photographic variables that you want to, whether it's shutter speed, whether it's aperture or ISO, and so the FV mode, it means flexible value. And so, you have the capability of setting the camera up to be able to adjust, one or both or all three of those, just according to how you want to engage the technology. So we all know that you have shutter speed priority, you have aperture priority, you have program, but you don't always have access to be able to sort of override some of that functionality. Say for instance, when you're in the program mode, the camera's doing it all for you. Well, in the FV mode, you have that capability of being able to turn some of that automation off and still be able to control it. And so, just depending on how you want to engage what the camera is doing for you, you can make the technology really work for you, but not be, strictly tied down to what it wants to do. And I think that's really important in terms of, you don't want to have to work around technology. You want to work with it. And that's where it really, it works for you better that way.
One of the things I appreciate, especially as making the switch to mirrorless, is the fact that all the buttons are customizable to do what you want them to do.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's to me that's been a pretty good game changer for me, is just to kind of set up the camera like I feel like I'll work best, and really using some of those buttons that are not like the old DSLRs and the film cameras had the depth of field preview button. And I bet I haven't
Right.
touched that button 10 times
you,
my entire life. But now,
and
now you can customize it.
one of the things you can do with a digital camera now too, and especially with a mirrorless camera, is everybody knows if you ever played with a depth of field preview button, when you're looking through the viewfinder of the camera and you press it, everything in the viewfinder gets dark.
Yes.
And you can hardly tell what's going on. Well, now with an electronic camera, and especially with a mirrorless camera, you can have a depth of field preview button that you can actually turn on exposure simulation that will boost the gain on the sensor to actually allow you to see what depth of field is really doing. So the viewfinder doesn't get dark. You can see exactly what's going to be in focus when you engage depth of field preview and exposure simulation at the same time. You can see it 100%. So, some of that functionality is things that, are ultimately their benefits for all of us when it comes to using these cameras.
Let me run you through my wish list and tell me if and it's more likely I just don't know what I'm doing with these cameras, why I'm missing this. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Let me mention one other thing too,
Okay.
that, this is one of the developmental things that have come in, and a lot of people have sort of told us, and I will tell you, three things always factor into, to sort of what goes into a camera that people are asking for. One of them is size, the second one is weight, and the third one is cost. And, one of the things that you have to sort of look at when you start working with a camera is, well, how small can it be? How lightweight can it be and still have the functions you want it to have? And then when you start going through all of that functionality of what technology allows that all to happen, how much are you willing to pay for it? So those things always play into the mix. But, the other thing you have to consider is that, when a camera starts getting small, where are all of the buttons? And when your hand has to fit on the camera, how does your hand, fit over all of that real estate that's on the camera itself? And so, we've had, and I personally have had cameras that people have brought to me that have said, well, this camera's just too small for my hand. Well, you should have known that when you walked into the camera store and started holding it and started realizing how big is your thumb and how much of the real estate on the back of the camera is it going to cover. Those things all play into the mix. So, sometimes there are limitations in terms of size and weight that we have to sort of be able to deal with, and then we sort of work from there.
That makes sense. Yeah, I was in Alaska with a couple of product engineers back at the 1st of September. And when I gave them all my wish list, we decided that the camera that I was going to design would weigh 27 pounds and probably cost $30,000.
Well,
And
I used to have people all the time. They asked me when were we going to get like a 20 millimeter to a 400 millimeter lens that was an f2.
Oh yeah.
And I said, hey, I'd be right there with you if all things considered, if we could really make it, but the question that I would always have to come back with, and this was only because the engineers asked me the same question: how much are you willing to pay for it?
Yeah,
And
but
then how many are we going to sell at that price?
I think a perfect compromise is that 2 to 400 millimeter, because that's a beautiful lens. That
It's an
zoom,
amazing lens.
it is. Hey, I'm gonna tell you my wish list for what it's
Okay.
worth. Now, my first wish list was just for comedy's sake. I started to turn on the closed captions before we started because I'm really curious to see how Zoom distills my Texas accent for the rest of the country. Because like Jan Waterhouse, I thought I was going to have to get a translator when she was with me back last summer to translate what I was trying to tell her.
Where's Jen from?
Iowa.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Go Hawkeyes.
Hey, so, and this is all of these wish list things that I have all speak to my weakness as a photographer, Bob. So let me preface that first. I wish there was some kind of reset button that, when I go into, say, a specialized mode inside of my camera, that I could just press the reset button to set it back to a standard set of settings, like say F4, or set the aperture back to F4 and set the ISO back to a standard settings. Because one of the biggest mistakes, and I've taken millions of pictures in my life, but one of the biggest mistakes I make is I may be set up to do, let's say, an HDR shot, and then I'll forget to reset my camera back to the way it was, and I'm not ready for the next shot. So
Right.
I wish, is there a way to, is there a reset button on like these R5s or anything that you can
Well,
program it to reset?
I don't know that it's so much a reset button as it is a setup button where you actually program the camera to do what you want, and then just rotate the mode dial on top of the camera back to the standard function, so that, right here on the mode dial, we have what is a C1, a C2, and a C3 mode. And
Yeah.
so for something like HDR, just set one of those custom modes,
Oh,
1, 2,
okay.
or 3,
I-
to do your HDR. And then when you're done with it, just rotate the dial back out of C1, 2, and 3, and you're right back into the normal operating mode.
See, and that makes sense, but I told you that's my weakness as a photographer, is
Well,
I never think beyond those things.
but that's how extensive the technology is in the cameras now, that they have that capability of even memorizing, the functions that you set into them. And even if you set one of those custom modes up, you can tell it, well, if you make any changes while you're in that custom mode, you can tell the camera to update those settings that you make to make it sort of a, it's artificially learning about how you're using the camera in that mode. So you can make it progress from there even.
Speaking of that, I wish it would artificially learn, and maybe you can do this too. I wish it would artificially learn that when I put my 500 millimeter f4 lens on the camera, it would know, because I've taken so many pictures with it, that Russell likes to have it set at f5.6, and it would automatically default to that when you put the lens back on. Or when I'm shooting my 16 to 35 millimeter, that it knows that, hey, Russell likes to shoot this thing at f11 for starters, so I'm going to start him off at f11, and he can adjust it from there.
Well, you
There's
have
no way
multiple custom modes.
you can do that in custom modes.
Well, yeah. So you have C1, C2, C3. So, maybe you have one of them set up, custom 1 mode is for HDR. C2 is for your 500 f4 at f5.6. And C3 is for your 16 to 35 at f11.
See, what I'll leave this off with, that you're the smartest guy I know. That's what I left this whole conversation off with.
The only reason that I know this stuff now is because people have brought me the questions before. And, one of the greatest things about me going out and doing workshops, and Earl and I know this, it's one of the greatest things that we learn about photography is what other people want to know. And, being able to sort of, you have to learn how other people think too. And that can improve the way that you think and see as well.
Yeah.
And part of photography is just the way that, we look at the world. And, part of, there are people that I know that they are amazing observers, just in terms of the things that they can see. And you think about what a really good photographer is, and that's what a really good photographer is an amazing observer, because you're seeing things that other people don't see. And that's one of the things that when I learn about how people, use cameras and how they take pictures and whatnot, that also teaches me a lot about how they're seeing the world too.
No, that's
So,
valuable. You're exactly right about that.
yeah.
Well, so what's on the horizon? Can you talk much about what's coming down the pike?
New product for us is just as big a mystery most of the times as it is for you guys, which is unfortunate. But one of the things that has happened in the last 25 years when digital photography has started progressing along is, we have all these websites, and everybody's interested in being the first one on the web to promote some kind of new product or new feature or whatever. You saw it on DP Review first, or it was on Petapixel or wherever it might be. And Canon used to do a lot of pre-disclosures and stuff. And one of the early pre-disclosures back in the day that we did was, for the original EOS 1 DS, which was, it was a really high-end professional camera. Wasn't a high megapixel camera, but it was the closest thing to a full-frame digital camera that Canon was to make at the time. And it was a $25,000 camera, and they spent I don't know, probably the better part of the month leading up to the introduction of that product, which was to be introduced at a Canon stockholders meeting in Japan by the president of the company. And in that pre-disclosure period, there was an information embargo that people had to sign the non-disclosure agreement and all this kind of stuff. And 4 days before the product was to be released at the stockholders meeting, one of those media outlets broke the information embargo. And guess what? When the president of the company got up in front of the stockholders meeting, he had no surprises to introduce.
Oh,
So after that, he pretty much said, it's on the Canon website first, nowhere else.
I got you.
And so, our information now, they hold it very close to the vest because, just corporate espionage now is one of those things that everybody tries to one up each other. And so when new product hits, I'll tell you when the original EOS R camera came out, it was probably one of the best kept secrets in the photo industry in quite a while. And that was pre-COVID in 2018.
Yeah, I remember that.
And, there were a lot of people that some of these media outlets, they were pissed at us because we didn't tell them anything about it, and so they got the information basically the same time that everybody else did. And, we said, well, you got to do what you got to do. And we
Well,
wanted to keep it a secret.
it appears
So,
that there's a lot of innovation that goes on continually because it's, depending on who you listen to. I mean, I don't really get caught up in these conversations a lot, even though I know they're a part of the reality we live in if you follow photography. And that, all of a sudden Nikon will come out with the Z9, and it's, it'll do all these things that the Canon and the Sony can't. And then all of a sudden Sony comes out with a new one, and then Canon comes out with a new one. And I like the fact that at least that game's being played, because it seems like from a corporate level, it's keeping everybody honest and innovating at the same time.
competition is good for everybody.
Yeah, and it all trickles down to us.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about some of the. I know Canon has recently introduced a few new camera models and a few new lenses, particularly the crop frame
Right.
style cameras.
So
Tell us about those.
So the R system, when it was originally introduced, the whole idea was, again, sort of redefining what people could do with image quality and everything else. And, when the early days of digital, everybody sort of said, well, your highest image quality is going to come from a full frame camera. And so Canon said, well, if we're going to introduce a new mirrorless system of cameras, everything's going to be full frame. Well, so full frame has its place until everybody else starts screaming about, I want a smaller, lighter, cheaper camera. And one of the ways that you can do that is change some of the sensor technology that's in there. And that's where the R7 and the R10 have come from. But interestingly enough, the only thing really that has changed in those cameras has been the sensor size. The processing horsepower in the cameras is pretty much the same as the R5 and the R6. There is a little bit of different layout on the cameras. Again, a lot of it based on camera size, because the R7 and the R10 are quite a bit smaller than the R5 and the R6 and the R3, but they're very high functioning cameras that are designed more for the entry level market that that they want a high functioning camera with a lot of horsepower, and that's exactly where they are. They just don't have a full frame sensor.
I haven't used them, but I've heard a lot of good things about those cameras.
Well, I got a friend, a former work associate down in San Antonio that he is he has become a very qualified birder, just in terms of not only identification, but his photo skills have sort of translated across into that birding hobby that he has now. And you start working down around San Antonio and a little farther south there, and there's some pretty interesting birding opportunities in South Texas. And my friend Don recognizes that. And so he has actually he started off with an R6, and he liked its capabilities and everything. And one of the things that's nice about the R5 and the R6, that even though they're full frame cameras, you can force the camera into a crop censored mode so that you have a camera that functions like an APS-C camera too, which is where the R7 and the R10 are. But one of the things that happens with birding and wildlife photography is that you always seem to be looking for more lens. And, when it starts coming to cost, that becomes a prohibitive factor for a lot of folks, that you can't go out and buy a 600 f4 because, it's big, it's heavy, and it's expensive. And so with that smaller censored camera, you can have a smaller lens and you can still have it very high functioning. But with that smaller sensor, you also have more magnification on the lens, which helps you in pursuits, like wildlife and birding. So that's where those two cameras have sort of come in and found their place. They're very much consumer cameras, but they're very high functioning in terms of those capabilities, in terms of those kinds of pursuits.
Before this webinar started, we were talking about lenses like this that Canon introduces. This is the 800 millimeter f11 lens that
Right.
I picked up when I bought my R5 about a year ago.
Now,
And
do us a favor and actually pull that out to the actual, so that's the actual full size of the lens. And I can tell everybody that's on here, a normal 800 millimeter lens is almost 3 times that length. And so, that's one of the kinds of things technologically that Canon has done, that people were woofing about us, at us before about, where's your technological innovation? Well, there's some optical innovation right there that people, they had no clue that a lens like that was coming along. But think about that 800 millimeter lens on a crop censored camera, which increases the focal length by a factor of 1.6. That 800 millimeter lens, now is even more than 800 millimeters, and it's a very significant birding tool. Yeah, 1280 millimeter lens, that's very small and very lightweight. And, even for the average, 65 or 70-year-old birder that's, tripping around the World Birding Center in South Texas, carrying that combination around all day is not a problem. So, those are the kinds of things you have to think about. So,
no, I agree. It's that's why I still get excited every day. I tell people all the time, or when they ask, that for me, it's always been a blessing to have my vocation and avocation the exact same thing. I mean, when I have time to kill, I do photography for a hobby, just like I do photography for a living. And so it's every day. And that's one of my carry around lenses on my farm here, is that 800 millimeter f11. I'll get out every day and kind of roam the place and look for things to take pictures of. And so,
well, you never know what you're going to see, and they're always going to be too far away.
Yeah. I try to get close, try to be stealthy.
Right.
Well, hey, do you want to take a few questions?
Absolutely.
I'm going to unmute.
And I want to finish this part of what we were just sort of
Okay.
talking about before we opened it up too much. And, I mentioned to you before that my grandfather was, he was early on, he told me some things that I had no idea about. And he told me that when you can find something that you're passionate about, that somebody will pay you for, the fact that it's never work, that has worked for me for more years than I care to admit. And, it's just one of those things that, when I realize, over the years of how long now that I've been involved in photography and how passionate I am about it and how I like sharing it with people, I never like to think about it as work, because it's not. So it's a good place for photography to be.
It is. That's kind of the way I feel. Well, I've asked everybody to unmute. So if you want to ask a question and you can't unmute, just let me know and we'll figure out how to make this happen. But if anybody has any questions for Bob, we've got about 10 minutes to go, and we'll be sure to let him impart his knowledge on us. And if not, I may have another question or two. People have stage
I'll
fright.
add something. I have a friend who wants to, she's probably 65, wants to get into photography. What would be a great entry level? I heard you talk about the 7 and the 10. What do you think? You're a camera and a lens.
What does she really hope to accomplish with it?
She has no clue. She just wants to get out and take pictures. So she doesn't really have a landscape or wildlife. She doesn't really know yet.
So one of the interesting things that's actually gone on with sort of the introduction of those two cameras has been, sort of opening it back up to that entry level of the marketplace, in the mirrorless camera market, and bringing the price point of a lot of these cameras down to a more approachable, consumer level. And that's always a factor. Go out there and look at, you can go to the Best Buys and the Costco's and the Walmarts, and you see those cameras that are at those kind of big box retailers, that those are very much entry level cameras. But you always run into that factor of there are limitations with them. But one of the things with the R7 and the R10 is that those cameras have so much horsepower in them in terms of what they're capable of. If you're trying to do, soccer pictures of your kids or your grandkids, and you need more lens, but you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of money, that smaller sensor is one of the things in that camera that really helps you. And, Russell showed that 800 f11, and anybody that knows anything about photography, basically that you're buying lenses most of the time based on the speed of the lens and how much light they let in. Well, that's one of the factors now that the technology and the cameras have allowed us to do so much more, because you can turn the ISO of the camera so far up that you don't have to worry about an f11 lens anymore. And Russell, one of the things I didn't ask you, you talked about using that lens in Africa. I didn't ask you, well, what was the highest ISO that you used your camera at to use that lens? And I can tell you, that it's probably at an ISO level that you never thought about using before, but now you can.
Well,
Oh,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I have people that routinely tell me that they're shooting an R5 or an R6 or an R3, at a sporting event, sometimes at a badly lit venue, that they're shooting at ISO 10,000 or above, and they're making pictures they've never been able to make before. And it's all a function of the camera.
Yeah. So to answer your question directly, when I was in Botswana, we found it. Well, the second night we were there, we were late getting back to camp, and so the guides were spotlighting for us on the way, and we found a leopard on the ground that was 20 yards away from the vehicle. And using the light of the spotlight, which to our eyes looks bright, but y'all know if you've taken a picture, it's not as bright to the camera as what it is to our eyes. So I shot that thing just to try out the camera at 25,000. Was it 25,600 ISO?
Right.
I think is what that number is. Anyway, I shot it around 25,000 ISO. Expected to be fully disappointed by what I saw, but what I saw when I looked at it later on, yeah, of course you can see the noise in it, but that 25,000 ISO is the same as 1,600 ISO was 10 years ago.
And it's the difference of being able to make a picture and not.
Exactly. Yeah. And with some of the,
That's where technology's working for you.
and with some of the software that you can use, I mean, that's a good picture. It's not a great picture that I took of the leopard. It's more documenting the saw leopard, because you never know when you're going to see another one. Turns out we end up seeing 10 more on the trip, but that would just happen to be the first one. But using, whether it's the noise reduction that you can use in Lightroom, or whether it's one of the third-party noise reduction applications you can buy. I mean, it really makes the difference. But noise, as a general rule, has never really bothered me that much at higher ISOs. But again, to your point, it was just amazing what that camera was able to do.
Right. So Dave, I would say just, I think at that point, it's a question of how much money she wants to spend, but either one of those, R7 or R10 are very high functioning cameras. And just, if she wants to do action, probably the R7 is a little bit faster, and it's going to be a little bit better focusing in those kinds of action oriented modes. But either one of those cameras is very capable of doing what, even any professional what any professional photographer would want to capture with them. It's just a question of they've had some of their size and weight and everything scaled down to address a different audience.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Dave, I keep hoping Bob, and this is a not so subtle hint. I keep hoping Bob will have an Oprah Winfrey moment any minute now and say, "You get an R3, and Jan, you get an R3," and he just passes one out for everybody like he was Oprah Winfrey. But I don't know if that's going to happen on this meeting.
I could use a lens for sure. I just bought an R5, so I'm kind of broke.
Yeah, you'll be happy.
Russell, Bob.
Yes.
This Glenn Hamburger, and I have an R5, which I've been using now for probably about 8 months, and I put it on my old 800 millimeter, which Russell, you used there for a little bit in Alaska, and the big heavy one. But the biggest problem I have is getting the auto tracer to pick up something very quickly, a very fast flying that goes by, and it's got to pick it up and immediately try to get it in focus. And I just, maybe it's the way I have the camera set, but I think it's a little slow sometimes to pick it up. Once it picks it up, it's all right.
Right. So one of the things I would suggest to you there, and this is one of those things that, when it comes to sort of learning to engage some of these products and the technologies that are in them, a lot of times when you're focusing on a small subject and you're trying to get what we call target acquisition in that regard, it's counterintuitive, but a small subject does not need a small focus target. The reality of it is that you actually want a larger focus target in the viewfinder for the camera to be able to look at, to be able to follow focus on a subject. And then in the case of the R5, if you turn on subject tracking, you can actually use those targets and you can adjust the size. And once the camera starts focusing on the subject, then the target will actually change size as it finds the subject, and it will zoom in on the target itself and will actually work from there. So in the case of, say you're trying to do a flying bird with that 800, I would say, put the camera in the facial recognition mode, but make it do the subject recognition, turn it on for animals, and let it start with a fairly large area to work with. And maybe it's multiple dots sometimes that flash across the screen. But once it finds the subject, you will be absolutely amazed how it locks on and how it stays on that subject, regardless of the movement, whether it's toward the camera or away, or whether it's laterally across the screen. It's just amazing how fast it works. So then it becomes more incumbent on you to keep the subject in the viewfinder.
And I'll add this too, Glenn. In my experience, I always talk about the Kenny Rogers doctrine of photography in my mind, that sometimes you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. And I say that because all this technology has its limitations. And one of the things I've learned, and depending on the animal you're taking a picture of, like I'll give this example back to Africa. Zebras are colored like they are to try to fool predators. Well, the eyes of the cameras have the same kind of issues trying to focus on when you have that continual contrasting of black and white when you're using the eye tracking focus. So sometimes, like Bob says, you just may have to outthink the camera and use a different focusing mode to be able to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. Because again, some of the wildlife you're going to be encounter that's why they're made, is to fool the eyes of something that's trying to eat them. And so and because of that, it has a tendency of fooling the camera sometimes too.
Right. Well,
And
and,
like
and
you said,
again,
yeah,
just make sure that, you know, when you're looking through the viewfinder of the camera, I mean, we have this whole area to work with right here, but how big or small is that relative area of the subject in relation to the frame lines of the viewfinder? So sometimes if you're working with a really small subject, you actually have to start with a bigger focus target to be able to keep it on
okay.
that subject. So
I'll
that'll help
certainly
you.
try that.
Yeah.
I might say one thing too. If Canon Professional Services, I belong to Platinum. That is one of the best services in the world. I've sent that 800 in twice. By the way, just mailing that in, it will cost you a total fortune overnighting it. But they pay for the in. They give you a loaner. I mean, it's incredible. It pays for itself immediately.
Well, and it's one of the things that Russell mentioned early on, you know, it's that we all know how well this camera stuff works. But when you get in a situation and if you're using it as a vocational tool, it's not always how well it works, because we know stuff happens and stuff gets dropped and, you know, gets rained on or gets mud splashed on it or whatever it may be, you know, but it's also about being able to get it fixed. And that's part of what the professional service is all about, because we realize people are out there using our tools for, you know, to make a living. And you have to have service that you can rely on to maintain that capability as well.
One last question. How well do the mirrorless, like the R5, can handle like wet weather, nasty weather, as well as the old like 1DX Mark III that Russell has there?
So the real answer to that question is the R5 and the R6 are probably more akin to the 5D Mark III and 5D Mark IV series cameras, you know, which when those cameras came out, we basically told people that they were equivalent to the old EOS 1 cameras, not like the EOS 1DX Mark III, because the 1DX Mark III can actually be in a full monsoon, you know, and it'll still work. But you know, as far as, you know, mist and just kind of rainy sort of, you know, foggy conditions, working in a humid jungle or anything else like that, you know, the R5 and the R6 are perfectly suited to do that kind of thing. I don't know that I would take them out into a heavy rainstorm without some kind of covering or, you know, some kind of, you know, top coat on them to at least attempt to keep them a little bit dry.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, if you're interested in a, you know, kind of an all-round cover that's good for a lot of different things, you know, I would tell you to you know, look into some of the rain covers that come from a company called Aquatech. I don't have any, you know, relationship to them at all, but I just know the people that use them. They absolutely love them and they swear by them, just in terms of their capabilities of keeping, you know, very expensive camera equipment dry and safe.
Yeah, actually, I
you know,
own one of those, and I also own the 5D Mark III and the 5D Mark IV. I mean, good God, I got a closet full of stuff here. So,
well, you know what I'm talking about then.
yes, I do.
The Aquatechs they're amazing.
Yeah, they're very good.
And actually, I don't know how much you know about them, but Aquatech actually came, you know, their rain cover business was very much an offshoot of where they started off making underwater housings. So they really do know how to protect a
Oh,
camera.
wow, wow.
Yeah. It's an Australian company and their underwater housings are probably some of the best in the world.
They are good.
Russell, what did you use underwater for the manatees that you shot?
I used two cameras. Actually, I've got a Acolyte housing that fits my Canon 5D Mark II. By the way, let me talk about that Mark II for just a second. You know, they say that those things are good for like, what is it, 250,000 shutter actuations. That's kind of the expected lifespan of it.
You can double it.
That 5D Mark II has 750,000 and it's
Yeah.
showing no signs of slowing down. So I use that, and then I also bought a housing called a G Dome that I use for my iPhone 14 because this will shoot in a raw format. And the reason why I tried this out is because if we add the manatees to part of the Florida workshop that we do, I wanted to try to figure out a way that people could get an entryway into underwater photography without having to spend a ton of money. And so by using smartphone photography, I found out that that's probably a good way to do it. But, you know, I tell everybody, if you're serious about underwater photography, invest in the money into the good underwater housings like Bob talked about, because those housings are the best.
It's all about having the right tool, regardless of
Yeah,
what you're
it-
trying to
it
do.
is, yeah.
You know, you think about a car mechanic, he's got a full toolbox sitting over in the side of his garage somewhere that's how he can fully work on cars.
Yeah.
And he doesn't do it with the weekend warrior tools.
Well, we've been at this, believe it or not, time flies when you're having fun. We've been at this for an hour and 1 minute. Does anybody else have any questions? Well, guys, I appreciate everyone joining us. And again, this will get posted to the YouTube channel in a couple days. I appreciate everybody showing up tonight and going on this new adventure with me. And so stay tuned for more webinars coming up, and I will talk to everybody soon. Bob, thanks a lot for your time tonight. Thanks a lot for being with us, and thanks for giving us your insight. I know I speak for myself that I love cameras, and I love Canon cameras a close second. So it's just it helps enhance my love of the natural world and just everything I get to go out and see on a regular basis. It's just Canon's helped be a big part of that. So I really
Well,
appreciate everything you're doing and your leadership in the industry and your dedication to the craft.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. And, you know, thanks everybody else for being on too. I mean, it's, you know, it's one of the great things about photography is that you can learn something new every day, and that makes the day better.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting, Russell.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you
Thank
much.
you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.